Stand by for broadcast.
You're listening to Inside Air, a behind-the-wire view of the Royal Air Force, its people, technology and operations.
Hello, I'm Flight Lieutenant Peter Lisney, and in this episode we'll look at the role of military working dogs in the Royal Air Force. We'll also reheat a few stories, just in case you missed them. But first, see if you can identify this noise. Find out if you're right at the end of this episode. Now, if you want to know who has the best superpower in the Royal Air Force, look no further than the RAF's military working dogs. Whether it's protecting people, fighting crime, or sniffing out danger, air dogs play a vital role in today's high-tech Royal Air Force. SAC Kerwin went to find out more.
Come from where they were in China and they've landed at Rise Norton and like, oh my god, what's happening? There's sirens, there's fire trucks, there's coaches everywhere.
We've had a couple of small finds out there, some weapons really. You know, if they got into a place where they could have been used against us, I don't even need to say what's going to happen really.
Well, I'd be very surprised in our lifetimes if technology can replicate a dog's sensory smell.
There are different types of military working dogs, and they're trained at the Canine Training Squadron at the Defence Animal Training Regiment at Melton Mowbray in Leicestershire. All of them are employed under the control of a handler and include patrol dogs, arms and explosives, search dogs, drug detection dogs and police dogs, which is where Corporal Katie comes in. She trained as a police dog handler for the Royal Air Force and was working with a 3-year-old Belgian Malinois when the coronavirus pandemic began. Corporal Katie told me more about her role.
I actually dealt with the first flight that came in before COVID was even a thing. It was just the Chinese flu at the time. Towards the end of January, I remember being set a task in, and at the time I didn't understand the severity of what we were doing. Like, don't get me wrong, it was a task in for me and I dealt it exactly the same, but I suppose as the pandemic went on, it was a very different job for myself anyway. Like, the patrol guys were still protecting aircraft, but we were dealing with a lot more antisocial behaviour.
What was it like at Rise Norton when the repatriation flights from Wuhan came in?
So I just remember having a call. I was actually, on the day before, I was actually off and on leave, and luckily I was in the local area. So I got a telephone call and was like, we need you for a tasking. We'll brief you accordingly. You need to be here at this time. And I'm always first for a tasking because I genuinely love doing my job and utilise my police dog. So I was like, yes, please, I'll be there. So being briefed and went into the tasking, and we kind of treat it like when we get a normal aircraft in anyway, that's obviously got something important on there, and it was kind of very much set up the same. So for me, it was very similar until you realise you've actually got people there that are coming off and being transported to elsewhere, and it's kind of mad actually. You're like, oh my god, it's people this time. I worked with Thames Valley Police because they had some of their officers on the ground. I was one of the first front by where the aircraft was, watching these people come down, ensuring that they got on to their subsequent transport.
Were the civilians worried at the time?
There was a young gentleman that both myself and the Thames Valley police officer that was with me, that we'd noted that was quite uncomfortable. I can understand from his point of view. He was coming off an aircraft to multiple agencies on an airfield, and it's quite a daunting process. And we both noticed him there and the way he looked, and he tried to come away from where he was being cordoned, and both myself and the officer managed to usher him onto the coach. So it was kind of like we had a bit of a purpose and calmed him down and got him on, but he was a little bit distressed, I think, because if you think about it, they're just general civilians. They don't don't really know what's going on. They've come from like where they were in China back to the UK, and they've landed at Rise Norton and like, oh my God, what's happening? There's sirens, there's fire trucks, there's ambulance, there's coaches everywhere, and it can be quite a daunting thing. So it's just making that transition as smooth as possible.
What exactly was the role of your dog during this tasking?
Essentially, she was next to me, and if needed, then she would have been deployed. I find either a dog will diffuse the situation or make it worse. It's one of those things. It's understanding when's best to deploy a dog. On that situation, I think that the asset was well used, and if needed, we could have been deployed if something had gone terribly wrong. Our job got a lot busier, essentially shutting down COVID parties, and some of them were ridiculous. You've got like 90 people having big massive parties and being utilised. A lot of antisocial behaviour because people were frustrated about being in and they had to keep their kids in, so we were deployed to at the local town to kind of disperse people and send them back. So it changed massively. We were well utilised.
The RAF can get called to help with civilian incidents then. How does that work?
We would utilise under a thing called Night Safe. It's a partnership with our local police force, so Thames Valley, and we go out. I went out as a police handler with a PCSO and varying turns of PC. It also meant that the police were able to send their officers as well, so they got a lot of exposure, which is quite nice because it's very different clientele from inside a base to outside a base. It's really good exposure as a handler, and like it kind of, people understand what we do a bit more as well, because for the whole of Oxfordshire there was 2 police dog handlers at the time, whereas in RF Rise Norton we had 5 that were licensed. You might as well use them.
What do you think about working for the RAF but policing the local community as well?
That's what we joined to do. We want to be used. It's great for us because it means that we spend a lot of our job training, and it's actually nice to be utilised and go out there and do, and it kind of makes the training worthwhile. It was just people, like giving people an education and understanding of why certain rules were in place, and I think at first people didn't really understand what was going on, and it was like a thing that, oh no, it's just the elderly that'll be sick. The young people thought they were okay, so you'd have like multiple parties that were happening and other things, and people not adhering to the rules of social distancing. So essentially I was there if it all kind of got a bit more, so that people would be sent in to disperse the party, and then if they get a bit leery, then you just send a dog in and nobody's messing when the dog's barking, unfortunately, and I would have been utilised if needed to, but that's a last resort.
Do you think people actually understand how much military working dogs do within the RAF?
Everybody understands the patrol handlers because they're out there on the airfield and they're seen, whereas some of the different assets like the police dog asset and some of the search assets are only utilised for tasking. So we come and go, we like nip in, do our job and nip out, and people don't really know what we do. So sometimes it's nice to showcase that, whether we work with outside agencies or even on base. If there's some sort of operation that we can support, we're always first to be like, yeah, we'll do it.
Why do you think that military working dogs are an asset to the Royal Air Force?
I can't track. I could try, but I can't do anything without that dog. So I owe a lot to the dog, because at the end of the day, something goes wrong, which I've had before. I've been assaulted on duty. The dog was there and the dog protected me. So that's number one. So they protect me. They're able to track for missing people or somebody that's able to flee a scene. They're able to find articles that have been hidden, or that could be stolen articles, that could be anything. They're able to do that, and push comes to shove and something goes wrong, I'm able to deploy that dog to detain somebody. So it's not me, it's all the dog. I just hold the lead and look pretty sometimes.
That was Corporal Katie speaking about the RAF supporting the police during the pandemic. She's now an instructor at the Defence Animal Training Regiment. I've mentioned it a couple of times now, and if you haven't heard of the establishment before, it trains animals for the Royal Air Force and even operates a veterinary hospital, but you'll hear more about that later. Firstly, let's hear from Squadron Leader Brocky, who's really passionate about animals within the RAF. He explained that the unit buys most of the dogs from a company in the Netherlands. Once they arrive in the UK, they'll quarantine for 10 days.
We would go out with 2 troop on the Canine Training Squadron who will go over to continent and procure the required amount of dogs needed. And that won't just be for the Royal Air Force, that will be for the other customers that we have, that we train dogs for here. Once we get them to the standard we're happy with, we will call in the Provost Marshal Dog Inspectorate team. Will come across, they'll do the ISAC, which is the inter-service assurance check, to make sure that, like a car dealership, it's got 4 tyres, it does what it says on the tin, and we're happy that it does it good to the highest possible standards. And then we will hand the dog, sign the dog over to the customer, this being the RF in this particular instance, and they will then take the dog further onto reteam, or we call it a reteam, with those handlers at that particular unit, guarding or doing whatever it needs to do as a trained military working dog.
What breeds have you got here?
So breeds, we have German Shepherd dogs, Belgian Malinois, Spaniels and Labradors, mainly for the specialist side, so the drugs, this vehicle search and the armament explosive search dogs.
Why do you pick those breeds?
Aggression, drive, discipline, intelligence, fitness. So when we go over to the continent and do the dog buys, we will always take a vet with us. One of the Royal Army Veterinary Corps veterinarians will go with to check that the dogs are fit, healthy. The breeder isn't trying to sell us a dodgy set of dogs or a litter. So yeah, there's always a vet that goes with the specialist trainers, dog trainers.
Are there any limitations with these dogs in terms of where they can actually be deployed to?
Geographically, Arctic conditions probably, but then we're very unlikely to probably have any need to go to any of those environments. But other than that, we've obviously proven the dogs in the deserts, in the far and Middle East. Certainly from an army side, obviously sitting here, I see both sides of the house. Yeah, we've got dogs over in the jungles that will do tracker work with the infanteers when they're under particular jungle training environments.
Now to one of the instructors based at the Defence Animal Training Regiment. Sergeant Poynton chatted to me in a bit more detail about the training that the dogs receive after they've finished their 10 days isolation.
The trainers will get their hands on them. They'll do a 2-week assessment, and then they'll move on to a 4-week assessment, which will be carried out by myself or one of the other sergeants in the training team. And then depending on the capability of the dog, so for example, protection dog, we look at about 8 weeks on average. And then we'll be looking at getting the customer in to view the dog for its inter-service acceptance check. So we do a lot of environmental training. The early stages of the training here at Defence Animal Training Regiment is environmental training and testing. So the first thing we'll do is sort of expose the dogs to as many different surfaces and noises as possible. Commonly, we do have training issues with sort of stairs sometimes and shiny floors.
How do you get them to overcome any issues?
There's a lot of experience here at the Defence Animal Training Regiment, and a lot of the dogs that we're getting through are even when we get them initially from Europe, they're at a good standard when they come in. We then train them past that standard and develop them and pass them out to the customers. The trainers are fantastic, and 9 times out of 10, someone will have either experienced that issue before or knows someone that has, or someone will have seen it. And there's always a possibility if a dog's not sort of making the grade at a certain specification, we can retrain it to another one. The only time we ever sort of really reject a dog is on a veterinary issue, and we'll take our vet's advice on that, and they'll normally get rehomed. We don't just train the dogs for the RAF. That's important to remember. We do train them for the Military Working Dog Regiment, and the MDP is one of our biggest customers. The MDP take a lot of police dogs off us.
Why are you so passionate about the benefits of having military working dogs in the RAF?
I think they are sometimes undervalued. I think they are a massive force multiplier, and because obviously predominantly they work at night time, not many people see the dogs and handlers out on patrol, but they are a fantastic asset to have for any unit, and they provide fantastic security coverage.
How are you adapting to current threats?
We have dogs here at the moment that we are constantly reviewing our training techniques to make sure that we keep them current with the current threat. So when the dogs pass out of the Defence Animal Training Regiment and go to the units, that they're good to hit the ground running. It's a constant evolving threat, and it's important that we're training our dogs to what's going on with the current climate.
That was Sergeant Poynton, who also told me that the military working dogs can pretty much work anywhere. So let's hear from Corporal Parton. He told me about his time in Afghanistan with his dog Alvin. I asked him about what sticks in his mind about his very first tour.
I was quite new out of training, so yeah, it was a new experience. You know, it's what I wanted to do, and it's why I joined up. So yeah, I was excited about it. Obviously a bit nervous as well, but yeah, just looking forward to it and couldn't wait to get out there, really. I had a really good tour. We had a good group of people with us, some good dogs, had some good experiences. It's probably like the first time you actually go out and do the job with them. You know, like, nerves are through the roof, but it's then being able to look back at everything you've done and like wow, actually now we're here and we're doing it. It's similar to like a person going on holiday or moving to a hotter or colder country. You just kind of take it easier for the first week or two, let them settle into it. So we still would work them, but we wouldn't work them for as long as we would have when we were back in the UK. And then over time that would just slowly build up. And again, that just comes down to knowing your dog, really knowing when they're tired, and you know, when you can carry on working them and when you just need to give them a bit of a rest.
Have you ever actually come across anything dangerous during the search of the vehicles?
So we've had a couple of small finds out there, some weapons, really. You know, if they got into a place where they could have been used against us, then yeah, I don't even need to say what's going to happen, really, do I? So it's going to be a bad day.
What do you do then if you've made a discovery? What's the process?
So we would just highlight it up to the commander, and then it's up to them to deal with it then, whether they go and retrieve. Usually if it's a weapon, they would just go and recover it themselves, and then deal with that from there. But obviously if it was something we couldn't see, so we wouldn't be able to know whether it was a weapon or an IED, then we'd have to call in the relevant people to then deal with that.
And what's the reaction then that the dog gives off?
All the dogs are different, and like handlers, after a while you will learn what your dog's going to likely to do before they actually indicate. So an indication is usually when they find the target scent. That can be different from each dog. So a lot of dogs will either sit or go into the down. Some will stand, and then depending on like the place of the scent, some may even like ear up towards it. Like that's quite obvious, but before that you'll kind of notice little things that your dog does. So, you know, it could be just a little bit of slowing down, a steadiness of the tail, or the complete opposite. You know, the tail could have been steady throughout the search, but then starts to wag a little bit more. There's quite a lot of cues that your dog will give you when they're getting onto something.
The military working dogs are in Cyprus too. Corporal Brin was deployed to RAF Akrotiri for 3 years with a yellow Labrador called Charlton. She and Charlton made sure that drugs didn't get onto the base.
I'm qualified in arms and explosives and drug detection, and then all RAF police handlers are patrol handlers from the start, and then we specialise. So in Cyprus I was the operational drug detection handler. I spent 3 years there. My main job was to do sweeps of the air terminal, so all the flights coming in and out of RAF Akrotiri. In Cyprus there is only one military drug detection handler, so you do get quite busy, but you also work alongside the sovereign base area police out there who have 2 handlers of their own, and they do all like the local stuff outside of the camps as well. I was fortunate to take a dog out with me, so I came to Melton. I did my drug detection course with a dog straight out of training here. So I had the bond before going to Cyprus. So he came from Melton out to Cyprus with me, spent 3 years in Cyprus with him. But I also had a second dog that was already out there and already experienced Cyprus life and what it's like, and she'd had 2 or 3 handlers before I got there. Obviously the dogs have better noses than people, and it saves us a lot of time. So the work that I was doing with Charlton out there would take me maybe half an hour, whereas if a person was to go and search all of those people coming in and out of the terminal, it would take a lot longer. When the dogs first get out there, you take it easy, so you do a lot of short walks and you make sure you don't go out working in the middle of the day and that. There's no aircon or anything for the dogs in the kennel, so it is quite hot, but they have swimming pools out for them and they are well looked after. They just take it easy until they're ready to work.
What are some of the highlights?
It's the different stuff you get to do. It's in Cyprus, you're next to the beach, so we got to jump in off the SBA police boats and swim back to shore. And
with the dog?
Yeah, with the dog as well, so yeah, it's quite exciting.
You've heard about the different roles of the military working dogs in their training, but what happens if they're injured? I met Captain Mosey, who's a veterinary surgeon. He ensures these animals are able to do their jobs. In our chat, he highlights the joint service nature of the Defence Animal Training Squadron.
The animals we work with, they, don't get me wrong, they are absolutely incredible and they do incredible jobs, but you just have to be that much more delicate around them sometimes. They need a little more of a calm approach because some of the jobs they do, they can be quite, they don't mean anything by it, but if you look at them the wrong way, if you approach too aggressively, they will let you know about it. So I think it's a much more delicate and slow approach. And we just have to be that much more wary around our working animals, certainly compared to those in civvy streets. And then I think the other big difference is we just always need to be hugely aware of what they are going on to do. So we always have at the back of our mind, right, what deployments is this animal likely to go on? Where in the world are they likely to end up? And that will really massively influence our treatment plans.
How would it influence them?
The big one is timelines. We need to be able to communicate to the end user when can we have this particular patient back in the game. It will also influence our considerations of the likely threats in that particular environment. A really topical one, given one of our patients at the moment, is just the threat that the environment can pose. So we've got a patient at the moment who's come back to us from sustaining quite a nasty wound in the jungle. And that is just a really anomalous and quite different patient to have to deal with.
Are there any common injuries that these dogs sustain?
We do see a lot of musculoskeletal injuries. It would be entirely appropriate to describe a lot of these military working animals as athletes, and therefore we see the same kind of musculoskeletal strains, injuries and damage as you would a human athlete. So I would say that musculoskeletal injuries are the top pathology that we deal with. Because we're so used to seeing it, we're pretty good at managing it, especially the pain element, and putting together really effective rehabilitation plans. We have access to hydrotherapy facilities, both here for the dogs that are at the DATR, and also we can link civilian hydro capabilities to any of the, for example, RAF dogs that are all around the country. We're also big believers in physio as part of the rehab program, and we're seeing really good results. After a period of injury, or another good example would be post-orthopedic surgery, we'll put in quite a detailed physio and, if appropriate, hydrotherapy plan in order to help rehabilitate the dogs back to sort of fighting strength, as it were. But equally, on the other side, we're also exploring a lot of what we're calling prehab, as in trying to develop the resilience within the musculoskeletal systems of these dogs, again to use the canine example, so that they are less likely to sustain these injuries in the first place. And it might be something as simple as just getting them out of the kennels that much more, doing stretches with them, exposing them to more complex terrain so that they can build up that muscle resilience. Because if you look at some of the operating environments that we'll be going into the future, where we think a lot of where we'll be in the urban or littoral environments, actually just walking them around a field as a poor example would not develop them for the complexities of the three-dimensional environment. So we'll do what we can to actually get them ready for that, in the same way as you or I wouldn't just go and run a marathon one day. It's something we'd have to build up to if we want any realistic expectation of not being injured.
How vital are you in keeping these dogs in their jobs within the military?
Recently, we've seen how much of a force multiplier they can be. It's a very, very useful asset to have and be able to bring into the operating environment. And I think for our ability to have both veterinary officers and veterinary nurses, and ultimately deployable clinical staff that we can project to the other side of the world, we can keep these animals going and keep them fulfilling their role and maintain this asset in some really quite challenging conditions. So I think the veterinary team as part of the military capability is vital, and it will be here for some time.
You mentioned about veterinary teams being deployable. Is the theatre always set up on operation?
The most recent examples are where something really quite big has happened. So your likes of Herrick and Tellick have justified the deployment of clinical personnel. We wouldn't necessarily deploy clinical personnel where actually a small number of dogs or a small team are being sent out. But the way we compensate for that is ensuring that, again, to use a canine example, the dog handlers have a really, really good understanding of veterinary first aid, or what we call pre-veterinary emergency care. So they will be able to deal with a good number of emergency traumas and incidences with their working dog that they can then use to stabilise that patient until we can get it back to veterinary care.
The job that a military working dog does is very physical, as we've heard. But do you look after their mental health as well?
It's a very novel and topical area of research, and trying to find the line between neurological issues and behavioural issues, and really trying to explore the area of the psychological impact. We understand it pretty well on the human side now, and we're trying to assess what long-term impacts our canine brethren are experiencing after they come back from potentially quite emotional and traumatic deployments. It is admittedly a novel area of research. However, we do everything we can to make sure that they are properly built up and exposed to the likely sounds and climates before they end up in the operating environment. And then equally, when they come back, there will be a period where they are not exposed to that environment, so that they can sort of adjust back to normality for a period.
Do you think that research that you mentioned is an important aspect that the RAF should be, taking notice of?
Yeah, and I think even the most fundamental examples, such as the noise that RAF dogs are likely to be exposed to, it's not something that we can just expose them to straight off the bat. It's something that needs to be built up so that they don't have that immediate fear when they're exposed to a particularly loud airframe or environment, for example. So we can use the research and mechanisms in order to gradually expose and build up their exposure to those sounds. And then equally, after the fact, we can make sure that, what they're hearing, to play on this example, hasn't been affected, to make sure that actually we've not injected a fear component into their behaviour. So it is very important, and the fact that we recognise it as so important on the human side means we have this inherent responsibility to explore it on the animal side as well.
Earlier, Squadron Leader Brocky mentioned about Provost Marshal dog inspectors, which manage all of the RAF military working dogs. So it's time to hear from one now. Flight Sergeant Ginger. I met him at RAF Waddington, where the kennels there have recently been upgraded. The welfare of these animals is high on his agenda.
The Provost Marshal's dog inspectors work directly for the Provost Marshal. We are the body that looks after the well-being and the welfare for all the military working dogs in the RAF. We cover certification, training, just a kind of one-stop shop for everything military working dogs for the RAF Police and the Air Force.
Why is the welfare of these animals important?
We ask our dogs to do a lot of hard jobs for us. They work extremely hard for us. They work round the clock 365 days a year. So it is imperative that we maintain their welfare and their well-being at the highest standards, and it's our responsibility to make sure that is maintained, and it's also essential that we can assure the Provost Marshal that his dogs are being looked after in the best possible way. So yeah, that's why it's important. We're obligated morally and ethically to look after our dogs, because they do such a service for us. Why wouldn't we?
What kind of measures or checks do you have in place to ensure that the standard of welfare is being met?
Part of our role is certification. So we ensure that the dogs are working to the correct standards. So that's guided by policy. So that's a big part of the standards of work. So it's essential that dogs that are searching for explosives and drugs are measured in the correct way to make sure they're doing things safely. Pastoral visits around the country, so we are visiting all of the dog sections all of the time. We carry out inspections on the infrastructure. We support the VStat, who is the Army vet, who bears overall responsibility for the health and welfare of dogs, and we support them all the time by visiting the units and helping the dog sections look after their dogs and making sure that they are doing things in the correct way. And if there are new ways of doing things, or we can learn from somebody else on how to do things, then that's what we're there for, to look into those things and make sure that we can apply new and interesting, exciting methods to what we're doing. So we're always adapting to make things better for our dogs.
We just had a look around one of the kennel at Waddington.
Yeah.
Can you just talk us through the change there and what the dogs were like?
Yeah, so RF Waddington's kennels are a brand new build, and definitely the newest build in the RAF, and we've seen that the new infrastructure at Waddington is really working very nicely. The dogs are very content and calm, as you saw in their kennels. They were loving their new environment, which is so good to see. And a contented, happy dog will 100% be a valuable asset when we take them out and we do our work and we ask them to do these things, because as you can appreciate, stress in anyone's life can affect your work and your primary role. So it's really important that we make sure that these dogs are well looked after so they can do their job properly when we ask them to. They provide amazing memories for anyone that works with them. So it'd be hard to pick out one or two, but Iraq and Afghanistan on dogs were certainly very interesting and challenging times, but such a fulfilling job wherever you go and do it, just because the capability is so valuable, and providing that capability to whoever you're working with, commanders really appreciate that capability when we are providing it for them. So yeah, it's just a very fulfilling job.
Another important question is, what's the future for the military working dog, especially when there's things like drones being used within the military? Squadron leader Brocky doesn't think they'll be replaced by technology just yet.
Yeah, there'll always continue to be a role for military working dogs, certainly in the deployed environments. I mean, you think about rapid escalation of warfare, and generally if we deploy somewhere, there's going to be a lack of infrastructure from a control of entry perspective, force protection perspective on the initial entry teams. So we need to maintain those roles in the UK as well as overseas, but obviously to be able to then deploy as and when we need to, and for all those future operations. We've obviously proven the dogs in the deserts, in the far and Middle East. Certainly from an army side, obviously sitting here, I see both sides of the house. Yeah, we've got dogs over in the jungles that will do tracker work with the infanteers when they're under a particular jungle training environment. I'd be very surprised in our lifetimes if technology can replicate a dog's sensory sort of smell anyway. Certainly, obviously, infrared technology and using drones, for example, to coin a current sort of phrase, is, yeah, I think they would work well together, most definitely. But I think from a tracking and sniffing and sensing assets, the dogs are still there. Be that for humans or weapons, drugs, etc. There's still going to be a need for the dog in the future.
So don't expect to see robo-dogs working for the RAF anytime soon. It was clear to me during these interviews just how respected military working dogs are within the RAF. As former police dog handler Corporal Katie said, "It's not me that's important, it's the dog."
This is Reheat on Inside Air. I'm LAC Victoria Andrews. The Chief of the Air Staff, Air Chief Marshal Sir Mike Wigston, has issued a statement as the UK's 20-year coalition operation in Afghanistan ended. He said, "Our operations since 2001 have denied extremists a safe haven to plot terror on our streets, and we should never lose sight of all that we did to improve millions of lives in Afghanistan during that time. It has been a phenomenal effort in the most testing circumstances and is testament to the skill, courage and resilience of everyone involved." Operation Pitting saw over 15,000 British nationals and vulnerable Afghans evacuated from Kabul in what was a fast-moving 2-week effort. Officer commanding No. 70 Squadron, Wing Commander Bailey of the Air Mobility Force made this statement as he departed Kabul airfield.
"I am very proud of what the detachment has done, and I'd like to thank all the deployed air crews, the deployed engineers and the whole force based at home in the UK. You have all played a part in our success."
Recent events in Afghanistan may have brought feelings to the surface for many of our service personnel, reserves, veterans, civil servants and families. Please be assured that there are many resources available to the whole RAF family. These can be accessed through the RAF website. Alternatively, please speak with friends, family and your chain of command. A series of interviews with personnel who have been heavily involved in all aspects of Operation Pitting, whether passenger and freight handling, security, medical provision or providing real-life support, can be viewed on RAF social platforms. Meanwhile, RAF Lossiemouth celebrated a double milestone. A new standard was presented to 120 Squadron, while the formal naming of the Poseidon Strategic Facility also took place. The impressive Atlantic building acted as a backdrop, appropriately flanked by 2 submarine-hunting Poseidon aircraft, as 60 personnel formally paraded for the first time since reforming in 2020. 120 Squadron is the RAF's first operator of the Poseidon Maritime Patrol aircraft. And finally to sport, SAC Luke Pollard has achieved his dream of becoming a Paralympian. Luke is a guide for visually impaired Paralympian Dave Ellis. They competed in the triathlon as part of the GB Paralympics team. Also competing at the Tokyo Games was former Regiment gunner Stu Robinson. He took gold as part of the wheelchair rugby team, the first ever gold in this event for Great Britain, with a closely contested 54-49 win over the USA. That's Reheat on Inside Air.
I'm SAC Simon Ross with this episode's Name That Noise. That was the sound of an Avro Vulcan. For those of you who know RAF Waddington well, you'll be all too aware of their Gate Guardian, Vulcan XM607. XM607 is famous for its role in the Falklands conflict and Operation Black Buck, a series of 7 long-range ground attack missions on Port Stanley launched from Ascension Island. You can usually spot XM607 standing proud opposite the RAF Waddington viewing area, but not at the moment. Work has begun to prepare the aircraft for a period of recovery and preservation, hopefully in time for the 40th anniversary of Operation Black Buck next year. This meant the aircraft had to be moved across camp under the expert control of the Joint Aircraft Recovery and Transportation Squadron. The renovation work is expected to take several months and will be well documented, so keep your eyes on RAF socials for more updates.
That's all for this episode of Inside Air. Please give us a review and subscribe on your favourite podcast app, and join us again soon.
You've been listening to Inside Air, a behind-the-wire view of the Royal Air Force, its people, technology and operations. If you're serving in the RAF and have a story for us, please speak to your unit media and communications officer. Inside Air is written and produced for the Royal Air Force by RAF Media Reserves.